There is a plant that survives -30-degree winters buried in frozen soil. A plant that produces more calories per acre than potatoes. A plant so packed with prebiotic fiber, it can reshape your gut microbiome in weeks. For centuries, it fed Native American tribes through brutal winters. European peasants grew it by tens of thousands of hectares. Homesteaders called it the ultimate survival crop because you plant it once and harvest forever. Then industrial agriculture looked at it and walked away, not because it failed to produce, because it refused to behave. It wouldn't fit the machines. It wouldn't sit in warehouses for months. It wouldn't become the bland, obedient starch that food corporations needed. So they let it fade into obscurity, pushed it into the margins, and convinced an entire generation that potatoes and corn were the only carbs worth growing. But this plant didn't disappear. It's still here, waiting in forgotten garden corners, spreading along riverbanks, and it's about to show you exactly why the system that feeds you was built to keep it hidden. This is the story of the sunchoke, the perennial carb that beat potatoes on every measure that mattered, and the industrial food system that buried it because it was too wild, too honest, and too free. The story starts in the woodlands and prairies of North America, long before Europeans arrived. Indigenous tribes across the continent cultivated a tall sunflower that grew 10 feet high, bloomed with bright yellow flowers, and hid its treasure underground. Knobby tubers, sweet and crisp, that could be dug from the frozen earth all winter long. The plant was Helianthus tuberosus. The tubers were food, medicine, and insurance against starvation. They didn't rot. They didn't need cellars. You left them in the ground and pulled them up whenever hunger came. When French explorer Samuel de Champlain encountered the plant in 1605, he tasted the tubers and wrote that they rivaled the artichokes of Europe. He brought them back to France, where they spread across the continent within decades. By the late 1600s, sunchokes were planted in gardens from Italy to Germany. By the early 1900s, Europe had roughly 80,000 hectares under cultivation. Farmers grew them for livestock feed, human food, and alcohol production. They thrived in poor soils, cold climates, and neglected fields. They required no fertilizer, no pest control, no replanting. You put tubers in the ground once, and they came back every spring for decades, and then they vanished. By the mid-20th century, European sunchoke acreage had collapsed to a few hundred hectares. In North America, they became a niche crop, grown by hobbyists and survivalists, but absent from grocery stores and commodity markets. The plant that once fed continents was rebranded as a weed, an invasive nuisance, something gardeners planted once and regretted forever. What happened? Did the crop fail? Did it stop producing? Did people stop needing carbohydrates? No. The crop didn't fail. The system rejected it, because sunchokes refused to play by the rules that industrial agriculture demanded. And those rules were written in the language of machines, warehouses, and profit margins, not nutrition or resilience. Let's talk about what sunchokes actually are and why they terrified an industry built on control. Sunchokes are perennials. That means they don't die after harvest. Any tuber fragment left in the soil will resprout the next spring. One planting becomes a permanent food source. Modern agronomic trials report tuber yields of 16 to 20 tons per hectare, with some varieties pushing higher. Foliage biomass reaches 18 to 28 tons per hectare. That's comparable to or better than potatoes, with none of the replanting, none of the chemical inputs, and none of the fragility. A recent trial in Ohio tested 5 sunchoke varieties and recorded aerial dry matter of nearly 9 to 22 tons per acre and tuber dry matter of 4.5 to over 13 tons per acre. The researchers emphasized that sunchokes are a resilient, low-input crop that resists weeds, pests, diseases, and drought. They tolerate temperatures from 6 to 27 degrees Celsius, soil pH from 4.5 to 8.2, and annual rainfall from 31 to 282 centimeters. And they can overwinter in soil down to minus 30 degrees Celsius. You can forget them, ignore them, leave them buried under snow, and in spring they come back. For a homesteader or gardener, this is a miracle. Plant 10 tubers in a corner bed, and by fall you're pulling 30 kilograms of food from the ground. Leave some in the soil, and next year you get even more. Permaculture forums are filled with people calling sunchokes one of the most productive perennial carbs per square metre, especially on poor soils that won't grow much else. But that same trait, that aggressive perennial nature, is exactly what made industrial agriculture walk away. Because if you can't kill it, you can't control it. And if you can't control it, you can't sell it. Now let's go deeper, into the chemistry, into what makes sunchokes different from every other carb crop you know. Potatoes store starch, corn stores starch, wheat stores starch. Sunchokes store inulin. Inulin is a type of fructan, a chain of fructose molecules linked together in a way your body cannot digest in the small intestine. When you eat a potato, enzymes in your stomach and small intestine break the starch down into glucose, which floods your bloodstream and spikes your insulin. When you eat a sunchoke, the inulin passes through your stomach and small intestine intact. It reaches your colon undigested, and there it becomes food for bacteria. Not harmful bacteria, beneficial bacteria. The species that produce short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, the molecule that nourishes the cells lining your colon, reduces inflammation, and protects against metabolic disease. A 2023 study in mice fed a diet enriched with 2.5% inulin from Jerusalem artichoke and found significant changes in gut microbiome composition and increased cecal butyrate production. Other studies in animals show that inulin can improve intestinal health, support growth performance, and even enhance cognitive flexibility through microbiome modulation. This isn't fringe science. This is mainstream prebiotic research. Inulin is one of the most studied functional fibers in nutrition. Sunchoke tubers contain roughly half to nearly a full pound of inulin per pound of dry matter, with total sugars making up 80 to 97% of dry weight. That makes them one of the richest natural sources of prebiotic fiber available. Functional food researchers highlight Jerusalem artichoke as a promising ingredient for managing type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome because it doesn't spike blood sugar the way starch does. Instead, it feeds your microbiome, supports gut barrier function, and helps regulate appetite and inflammation. But there's a cost, and if you've ever eaten too many sunchokes at once, you know exactly what that cost is. Intense, prolonged, sometimes painful gas, because when inulin ferments in your colon, it produces gas as a byproduct. If your gut bacteria aren't adapted to processing large amounts of inulin, that fermentation can cause severe bloating and discomfort. Gardening forums and permaculture groups call them fartichokes. Some growers swear that white varieties are less farty than pink ones. Mainstream nutrition outlets warn that jumping to large servings of Jerusalem artichoke can trigger intense digestive distress. And there's more nuance. A 2025 study in mice with induced colitis found that purified inulin worsened the disease by increasing bacterial load and allowing microbes to penetrate a compromised gut barrier. That suggests that for people with severe inflammatory bowel disease, high isolated doses of inulin may be harmful, not helpful. Your gut is not a universal machine. Some people's microbiomes handle inulin beautifully. Others suffer. The key is starting small, cooking thoroughly to partially break down the inulin, and giving your bacteria time to adapt. This isn't a magic cure. This is a powerful tool that your gut either loves or absolutely hates, depending on the microbes you've built. But if you introduce it carefully, cook it well, and eat it in reasonable amounts mixed with other foods, sunchokes can be one of the most microbiome-friendly carbs you'll ever grow. So we have a crop that's perennial, high-yielding, climate-resilient, and packed with prebiotic fiber. A crop that fed Native Americans for centuries and European peasants for generations. A crop that modern science validates as a functional food with real metabolic benefits. Why isn't it in every grocery store? The answer is brutally simple. Sunchokes don't behave. They're knobbly and irregular, making them impossible to wash, peel, or grade with automated equipment. Potatoes are smooth and uniform. You can run them through optical sorters, mechanical peelers, and packaging lines at industrial speed. Sunchokes jam the machines. They have thin skin and high respiration rates, which means they lose moisture and shrivel fast once dug. Without careful cold storage at 0 to 2 degrees Celsius and humidity near 95%, they can soften, mold, or rot within a week. Commercial storage trials report loss rates of 19 to over 40% depending on method. That's catastrophic at industrial scale. Harvesting is a nightmare. The tubers hide at different depths, break easily, and cling to roots. Mechanical harvesters designed for potatoes leave half the crop in the ground. And because sunchokes are perennial, any tuber fragment you miss will re-sprout next year. That means you can't fully clear a field. You can't rotate crops cleanly. Farmers describe them as semi-invasive, spreading beyond boundaries, popping up where they're not wanted. In Central Europe, Jerusalem artichoke is now classified as an expanding invasive species, colonizing moist habitats and displacing native plants. For an industrial system that demands predictable, controllable crops that fit tidy rotations and mechanical harvest, sunchokes are a nightmare. And then there's the processing problem. The carbohydrate in sunchokes is inulin, not starch. That means it doesn't fit existing food and fuel infrastructure. In the 1980s, a Ponzi scheme promised investors massive profits from sunchoke-based ethanol. The scheme collapsed, partly due to fraud, but also because there was no infrastructure to process inulin at scale. Unlike starch or sucrose, inulin requires acid or enzymatic treatment to break it down before yeast can ferment it. That's extra steps, extra cost, extra complexity. Sugar companies and ethanol producers looked at sunchokes and saw a crop that didn't fit their refineries, their supply chains, or their profit models. So they stayed with corn, potatoes, sugar beet, and cane. Crops that obeyed the machines. Crops that could be stored, shipped, and processed with existing technology. Sunchokes didn't fail. They refused to cooperate. And in an industrial system, refusal is the same as failure. So the crop that once covered tens of thousands of hectares quietly shrank to a few hundred. It became a niche product sold in organic markets, a curiosity for foodies, a plant that permaculture enthusiasts grew in backyard food forests. It was erased not by conspiracy, but by economics, by path dependency, by an industrial system that had already invested billions in crops that fit its machines and had no interest in building new infrastructure for a stubborn perennial that most consumers had never heard of. But the plant didn't die. It slept in seed catalogues, in forgotten garden plots, in the wild spreading along riverbanks and roadsides, waiting for people who remember that food doesn't have to fit a factory. And now, as consumers search for healthy, nostalgic foods and superfoods, sunchokes are experiencing a minor renaissance. Permaculture designers call them one of the ultimate perennial staples. Homesteaders brag about 30-kilogram harvests from a single planting. Health food advocates promote them as a prebiotic powerhouse. The plant that industry abandoned is being reclaimed by people who want food that's real, resilient, and independent. So how do you actually grow and use sunchokes without regret? First, understand that they will spread. Don't plant them in the middle of your vegetable garden unless you want them everywhere. Use a dedicated bed, a corner plot, or large containers. Plant tubers in early spring, 4 to 6 inches deep, about 12 to 18 inches apart. They tolerate poor soil, but they'll produce more in decent dirt with full sun. Once established, they need almost no care. Water during extreme drought, otherwise ignore them. They'll grow 8 to 10 feet tall, bloom with yellow flowers in late summer, and by fall the stalks will die back. Harvest starts after the first frost, which converts some of the inulin to simpler sugars and improves flavour. Dig carefully. Use a fork, not a spade, to avoid slicing tubers. You'll find them clustered around the base of the stalk. Pull what you need and leave the rest in the ground. That's your storage. Mulch the bed heavily, and you can dig tubers all winter in most climates. If you harvest more than you'll eat immediately, store them in the fridge in a plastic bag or container with high humidity. Even then, use them within a few weeks. They don't keep like potatoes. For cooking, roast them. Slice them thin, toss with oil and salt, roast at 400 degrees until crispy. The roasting caramelizes the sugars and reduces the sharpness of the inulin. You can also add them to soups. Simmer them with potatoes or other root vegetables, or mash them. Start with small portions. A few slices, not a whole bowl. Let your gut bacteria adapt over days or weeks. If you jump in with a massive serving, you will regret it. But if you introduce them slowly, cook them well, and mix them with other foods, most people tolerate them fine and enjoy the unique, slightly nutty, sweet flavour. And here's the bigger picture. Sunchokes represent something that industrial agriculture cannot tolerate. Abundance without dependency. Food that regenerates itself. Crops that don't need annual purchase of seed, fertilizer, pesticides, or fuel. For gardeners and homesteaders, that's freedom. For corporations, that's a threat, because if you can grow 30 kilograms of nutrient-dense carbs from 10 tubers you planted once, you're not buying seed potatoes every spring. You're not buying fertilizer. You're not reliant on supply chains that can break at any moment. Industry needs crops that obey machines. Gardeners can grow crops that obey nature. That's the choice sunchokes force. And that's why they were quietly pushed aside. Not because they weren't good enough, because they were too good in ways that didn't generate profit. Today, the ancient perennial food market is exploding. Consumers are desperate for crops with history, resilience, and authenticity. Sunchokes fit that story perfectly. Native to North America, grown by indigenous peoples for millennia, adopted by European peasants, proven in modern agronomic trials, validated by prebiotic science, and still here, still producing, still waiting for people who want food that doesn't come in plastic. If you have space, plant them. If you have a farmer's market nearby, buy some tubers in fall and experiment. If you have a gut that tolerates fibre, give them a chance. Start small, cook them well, and remember that the crop your great-grandparents forgot might be exactly what your microbiome needs. Sunchokes didn't disappear because they failed. They disappeared because the system chose control over resilience. But the system doesn't control your backyard. It doesn't control your kitchen. It doesn't control what you choose to grow, to eat, to remember. And this plant is still here, still stubborn, still perennial, waiting for anyone willing to dig. If this vault opens something for you, subscribe to Rooted Way and hit the bell. Every share helps preserve this knowledge. The next vault opens soon, and the crop that refused to die is waiting in the ground.